My name is Ryan Pancall. Welcome to this webinar on pruning shade trees today. So we're going to focus on everything about pruning shade trees to keep them healthy in your landscape and keep them living for a long time. My name is Ryan. I'm a horticulture educator out of Champaign, Illinois. So I cover Champaign, Ford, and Iroquois counties in central Illinois is where I do most of my work. But I have experience in really all aspects of tree care. I've been involved in one or another form of tree care all my professional career. And so along with other things, pruning is one of those practices that I've done quite a bit of. And so let's get right into this then and talk about some of the things I hope you can take away from this presentation today. First off, just why do we prune? You know, when should we do it? Why do we do it? I'm going to spend quite a bit of time at the start of this presentation looking at how to make proper pruning cuts. We'll look at some diagrams, some real pictures, and hopefully get you, it really is some visual recognition you need to make a good pruning cut, and it takes some practice. So I want to cover quite a few different species we'll look at and different sizes of limbs. So hopefully you can walk away with a good idea of how to make a proper pruning cut, when to do that, and then at the end, we're going to look at some really specific examples of how to apply pruning to an entire canopy of a tree. And that's where this gets really tricky. Identifying just a single cut and making that single cut is pretty easy to learn. You'll see from the slides coming up, but actually applying those cuts across a whole canopy to, make sense of this pruning is difficult and takes a little bit of practice. So why do we prune? Well, it is one of the most important practices that we can do in the landscape. Woody plants are large. They take a lot of space. And it's really important that those plants exist in their space well. So that's one of the reasons why it's just so important. But it also keeps your plant vigorous and attractive. And so, the Annabelle hydrangea you see right here, those attractive blooms are a result of pruning. You can prune to accentuate those blooms. And there's definitely ways we'll talk about later that you cannot accentuate blooms with pruning. But it's also beneficial for plant health. And when I think of mature trees, large trees, those huge shade trees in your yard, structural weaknesses are something that we could have pruned out many, many years before they become an actual problem or a safety hazard. And in addition, there's also some pests and disease issues that we can handle, we can address with pruning. So in a nutshell, what are some of the foundations of good pruning? This comes from years of teaching other folks how to prune, and what are the things that I've seen people not pay attention to that results in, poor pruning in the end. One of the things is identifying that plant, and we'll talk about later how genus may be okay, but many times you really need to know the specific tree species that you're dealing with to understand what type of pruning prescription it needs. Don't make the mistake of just starting to prune in one tiny little part of the plant. You need to actually assess the entire canopy of the plant that you're going to prune. So you have in mind with each cut you make, what the purpose of that cut is in relation to what you're going to do with the rest of the plant. And never make a cut without a good reason. In the past, folks that I've been trying to teach to prune, they cut off a limb, and it's like I always wanted to know from folks on my pruning crews, why'd you make that cut? And when you don't have a good reason for that, and you just think you should have cut that, that's not a good cut. That's not a good reason to prune. And we'll talk about how if you follow an order of operations or an order of pruning objectives, it makes it a lot easier to sort through all the reasoning behind all those cuts. All right, so now let's kind of talk about how to make a cut. So believe it or not, yeah, there is definitely a right and a wrong way to make a pruning cut. And really, a lot of folks refer to this as natural target pruning. You can see this little figure here. It's right out of our Illinois Master Gardener Manual. And it kind of shows us the branch collar. So the branch collar region is, this area right here at the base of this limb that is kind of rumply looking bark. Is how I usually explain it, wrinkled bark that's right there. And we want to make a pruning cut that leaves that tissue intact right there. So we want to cut just right outside the branch collar. And the reason is that tissue that contained in that rumply bark right there is ready. As soon as that cut's made, it's ready to start to grow over that cut surface. And the reason why that's incredibly important is that cut surface is a vector for insect and disease to enter the trunk of our tree even. So it's a vector for rot to enter the trunk of our tree. It's going to make that tree less structurally sound. When I think of that big, large shade tree that it'll become someday, if we're pruning a smaller tree, it could introduce rot there that's going to, potentially cause branch or limb failure. Additionally, it saves the tree energy that if we prune in a different spot or we don't, and I'll show you some examples of this, it can cost the tree a lot more energy to reform that tissue or have to grow around a stub that we've left. So it also, preserves tree health to make cuts in this exact precise location. So going beyond our little model here, let's actually take a look at a real limb. And this is off of a crabapple tree. And you can really see that branch collar tissue. You can really see this kind of rumply bark right here. This is this area of tissue that's ready to, as soon as we make a cut, and here I'll draw a line that kind of makes us, there's about the line that we should cut on. And, these pictures are in 2D. I think if we saw this in 3D, you could see that although that line, it's sticking off the branch collar a little bit, that's the perspective of the picture, but that will be the place where we'd cut. So again, we're leaving that tissue right there. A common misconception is to make a cut that is just absolutely flush with the trunk, where we'd remove this tissue and we just would kind of follow the line right through here and just cut through some of that tissue. So that's not what we're going for. We want to make a cut right on that mark. Now, a question that comes up then is, in cases where we can't see the branch collar, there's not a really well identifiable branch collar in either of these pictures on a lot of the limbs that you see. What do we do? And so there actually has been, through research, a method developed that can help us, kind of estimate where that branch collar would be. And we know that those cells, those active cells that are ready to do this, they're ready to grow over and seal over that wound, are there and present at the base of the limb, but we just can't really see them. They're not as pronounced due to the growth pattern of the plant. And so the best example of this is really a codominant stem, like we see on this crabapple, where we have two limbs that are about the same size. And I'd like to look at how we would make a cut if we're going to cut off this limb on the right. Now, the thing I want to point out, though, is this is probably not the best cut to make, because another thing to consider about pruning cuts are the size of the wound that we're going to make relative to the diameter of the trunk. So right here, when we cut this limb off, we make a huge wound, and it's just about the size of the trunk right in here. So that's probably not a great cut, but this was a good picture to kind of illustrate how to make this cut. So just keep that in mind as we work through this example. But the first way to find this, where to cut on make a cut that aligns with the branch collar when we can't see it, is to identify this structure called the branch bark ridge. And here, I'll back off this slide just a sec, so you can see this bark right in here. On every limb, there is some way, shape, or form, some form of this that we can identify. So a little bit of bark that's kind of squished together right here as they grow, we should be able to identify in just about all limbs. So we start by identifying that. And the next thing we do is imagine a line that's 90 degrees to that branch bark ridge. And that's not always going to be as perfect and straightforward as this example here. That's why I kind of picked this, because it's a really simple, straightforward example of, vertical, that branch bark ridge is aligned really well vertically. It's perpendicular off the ground. So it makes this nice perpendicular line. But sometimes this branch leans to the side and it's a little bit different of an angle. So you have to be able to visualize first that 90 degrees. And then think of a line that kind of bisects that. So this is a 45-degree angle. That's half a 90. So we're bisecting that 90-degree angle. And that's the angle that we would cut at. So this yellow line right here is where we would make this pruning cut. And as you can see, the bark's all smooth through here. We don't really have an identifiable collar, but this is the best way we can kind of estimate where that collar tissue would be and make our cut in the proper place. So again, the worst thing we can do is cut off that collar tissue. We really want to get outside of it so that tissue's left intact after our pruning cut happens. All right, so let's look at a few real life examples here. These are a couple red buds that are all growing in a line. So the picture on the left, you can actually see that picture behind the tree in the picture to the right. So that's the same tree in both shots. So they're right next to each other, two limbs facing two different directions. So interestingly, the limb on the left is facing to the north. The limb on the right is facing to the south. Limb on the right gets a little more sunlight, so it's a little bigger in size. But right away, I can very easily see that on the limb on the left, you can really see this rumply bark, and right here's a transition where it changes to trunk tissue, and that's about where we would want to make our cut. But on the limb on the right here, we really have kind of almost like a codominant stem situation where this vigorously growing limb is keeping pace with the main trunk because it has a little bit more sunlight. And so we don't have a really well identifiable collar tissue right here. So again, we would want to do our same method of identifying the branch bark ridge on the right there. On the left, I've kind of drawn a line where you can see that's where we make our pruning cut. We leave the collar tissue intact and make that cut. So there again is that 90-degree angle. And then when we bisect that, we kind of get this 45-degree angle, which is, also a pretty textbook example right there of a really well-aligned couple stems to make this cut, but it can get a little bit more difficult when you look at other situations. So here at the end, there's kind of a look again where you can kind of see at the left that collar tissue should be sticking out to you some. And then on the right, there's kind of that 45-degree angle cut. And if you practice this enough, if you do it enough times, I mean, I can remember back when I first started pruning trees where I was really having to kind of think about, 90 degrees, how do I bisect that angle? I was having to really almost kind of hold my fingers at a 90-degree angle at times to visualize that. But after you've done it enough times, you start to be able to, your mind gets trained to see that, and you're able to kind of just automatically align about that 45-degree angle to the branch bark ridge. And it just starts to make sense. Practice really makes perfect on pruning. So definitely take some time to practice. And I'll show you a little bit later. The resulting growth after your pruning cut can tell you how successful you are with practicing. So here's a couple more examples of a sugar maple at the left and a sumac at the right. So the sugar maple on the left, I can see a little bit of bark tissue, branch collar tissue there. So I can really see where I think that line should be made. Same with the sumac, where I can see, my line on the sumac, again, due to the perspective of the picture, it's not really perfect, but you can see that collar tissue right around here that's right about where I'd make the cut to get rid of this weird limb. This limb is just kind of growing off to the side here, where these other two kind of made up the canopy that I was looking at in this case. So that limb, actually, I should have taken a picture after that was cut off, but it was actually pruned off. So again, just trying to cover some more examples. We'll move to like some smaller limbs. So oak trees have a cluster of terminal buds right at the branch tip. So on this little twig, you can see that cluster of buds, all of those became new limbs right there. So there's almost a limb on all four sides coming out of that twig right there. So we're going to look at cutting each of these to the left, where the red bud on the right, that's a pretty small stem. Both of these, I'd say the red bud stem that the arrow's on and the red oak stem, both of those twigs are about the size of a pencil or so. If that gives you a perspective, you can kind of see the red bud buds kind of in the back, the flower buds in the background there for some perspective. But to zoom in a little bit on these and just get a little closer up of a view, there's each limb where I've kind of zoomed in. In the case of the oak here, you can really see that kind of rumply tissue right here. You can see where we should cut. And, if I could draw this line perfect, it would probably go right along there and kind of curve a little bit. But we'll talk about pruning tools a little bit later too, that, pruning tool makes a straight cut. It doesn't really have the ability to make a curve, where on the red bud, I've kind of used, here again is that branch bark ridge. We can see it on the oak tree as well. I've kind of used that to just visually make this cut. This would be one, if I was working with hand pruners, I wouldn't have to think much. I would probably flip that off, but I would be paying attention to the angle of the branch bark ridge, the angle that the limb takes off the trunk to line that cut up correctly. So again, I encourage you to practice. Here's the example of a good cut and what it looks like just a few years after. This is a vigorously growing red maple, probably about 8-inch diameter at breast height. Diameter, DBH is that common term foresters use, diameter at breast height, to communicate that size. 8 or 10 inches though, about at breast height, and you can see that it has rapidly grown over this wound. That's actually really good growth here after just 2 years post-cut. This area right here is where pathogens are actually trying to attack this tree. And if this is left open longer, they have a greater chance of establishing, where by the time it gets to this point and it seals over, there's nothing getting in there. Trees, we say they compartmentalize that rot or that decay. This happens with any wound and within the trunk and other places, but it's grown over that, it's sealed it in, it's stopped any additional infection, and it's just kind of captured that rot that started right there inside that pruning wound. But you can see over time after you've made a cut, and I have a slide that shows a little bit more of this, how well this callus tissue is responding and growing. I've always said this looks kind of like a donut. So if your donut is perfect and symmetrical, like this one just about is, then it's a good sign you've made a good cut. And we'll see some not so great cuts a little bit later that can show you how that might look if you didn't make the perfect cut. So now let's look at little tiny twigs. So just another example of some twigs that show some good and bad cuts here. So there's kind of some captions at the bottom that tell you a little bit about, what's wrong with these. So in photo A there, we have, a little bit too much left past the bud. In photo B, although, we can kind of see this, branch collar tissue right here. In B, we've cut a little too close, because if we get that close to the bud, this little bud is what's going to grow into the rest of the stem here. That's going to dry out and desiccate. That's going to totally be dried out. And it's probably going to, this limb would probably die back to here. All this the tree would probably have to give this up and start here with this bud. So that's not a great cut. Here, this is what I call a dog ear. We've kind of missed by a little bit. And this is really the cut that we'd be going for, where we've left on a little tiny twig like this, we're pruning back to just a bud. We want to leave just a little chunk of tissue right there to keep that from drying out, or that bud from being stressed. So it's a little bit different than the objective when we have a larger stem. And finally, here's a good cut on a conifer, on a yew shrub. And so those are our two good cuts compared to the other examples here that just aren't quite great. We do say that pruning cuts seal, they don't heal. I've kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier, where we humans can regenerate tissue. We can we can regrow skin tissue if we have a wound. A tree can't regrow that tissue. It grows over it and compartmentalizes it. So each one of these cuts tells us a different story about how it was made. The red oak cut at the top left there, that's a pretty well done cut. That was fresh. That had just been made within a few months of me taking that picture. And you can see how the branch collar tissue is left intact. We've got a little bit of a weird area of trunk right here in a depression. So that makes this, sorry about that. I've advanced the slide too quick. That makes this look a little weird, but that was really done well right at the branch collar. Again, here's what we're going for. We want this perfect kind of donut shape. In the case of this red oak's cut, we've got a little bit of weird tissue growth right here. And, I don't know that that's so much that the person that made this totally cut into the callus or the collar tissue here, as it is maybe there's a defect behind this. There's maybe some rot and some included bark in this branch union. So that may be affecting the ability for the tree to grow callus tissue. But in this case, the branch collar was left intact, and this stuff that we see growing is called callus tissue. It's formed really symmetrically. So we didn't cut into the collar tissue, where here what I would guess is along this area where it's a little irregular, they've either cut into the collar tissue and removed a little bit so it couldn't grow as fast as it was over here, or we have a little bit of influence from this defect. This sugar maple is a cut that I made myself. And you can see I've missed the mark by a little bit. I cut into the collar tissue on accident here a little bit. And here there's more growth on this side. So I've left more of the collar tissue. I have more callus growth there than I do on this side, where I've cut into it just a little bit, got a little too close. And so that just illustrates that it's difficult, even when you know the things to look at, it's difficult to make that pruning tool react the way that you want and make that cut perfect. So don't get frustrated. Practice makes perfect. Practice and then observe the next year, and your tree will show you how well your cut was. So here's an example of a stub that was left on this tulip poplar at the left there. So I don't think that was actually a result of a pruning cut. I think that was a shade limb that the tree let die. When a limb on the inner canopy isn't producing enough photosynthesis that it's worth the investment from the tree's resources, it'll let that limb die. Like pin oaks and honey locusts, we see a lot of inner dead limbs. That's what's going on there a lot of times. And I think it's broken off here, but if we were pruning this plant, I mean, you can really see the callus tissue forming there. It's just, you can see that little donut coming out. But if you can visualize nothing happening here over time, all of this, it's going to take a lot of growth of this trunk for this callus tissue to grow all the way out and encapsulate this rotten stub. At the right here, this white oak, you can see that's what's happened there. I think this is a result of storm damage. This was down in Southern Illinois in the Shawnee National Forest at a parking lot. I got this picture of this plant. Those weren't pruning cuts. Those happened naturally. The limbs broke off or some type of storm damage, I think, again, happened. But imagine the amount of growth and resources this tree has put into growing over and sealing over these wounds, where if we make the cut in the proper location, this callus tissue can more rapidly close that cut up. So if we don't prune at this is a good example of if we don't prune at the right spot and we leave a stub, it can take a lot longer for this tree to grow over that. So here's another example of a tulip poplar at the left where somebody has made a cut on this plant. I think they probably cut into the callus tissue a little bit right here. That's pretty close to the trunk. But when that limb came off, it stripped the bark a little bit. You can see right here. So that ripped through if anybody's ever done some pruning, you've probably had a little bit of bark stripping. So you need to be really careful of that. The Siberian elm at the right is an extreme example of bark stripping. That was someone that made a chainsaw cut and it just tore the bark all the way down the plant. So look at the callus tissue that's forming there. But again, think of the opening that we've created for pathogens and think about the time it's going to take for that plant to really, truly seal over that wound. It's going to be many, many years of growth. So there is a really handy 3-cut method that we can use to not have bark strip. And I think a lot of folks communicate this in terms of a big limb, but this works even on smaller limbs that are heavily loaded at the tips. I do this a lot of times in a really quick fashion, even on small limbs that are down to the size of your thumb. If I'm pruning a species that has a real ability to strip bark. So there's certain species that are a little better at that. As I've alluded, tulip poplar is one of those. Okay, so in the 3-cut method, the first cut we make is right here on the bottom side of the limb. So before cut 2 or 3, so these are in order, before cut 2 happens, we cut right here. So that severs all these fibers right here. So that doesn't allow, as we make cut 2, then this diagram isn't perfect. Cut 2 goes all the way through. So we make a little tiny cut on the bottom, we cut all the way through the limb and let it fall. As this limb comes over, if bark starts to strip, it stops right here. So then at the end, when we make cut 3 at the collar tissue in a proper cut, it's just this stub right here is all we're cutting off. So there's no weight. And there's no ability for that stub, really, if we're careful in the way we cut it, to strip bark down the plant. So anyway, that's an example of the 3-cut method. I really suggest using it when you have a really heavy limb at the tips or a species that's just really prone to that. So now let's talk about pruning tools. So I'm going to go through this from maybe the things that make the best cut to the things that make the worst cut. And by best cut versus worst cut, what I mean is a nice clean surface. So if we can make a nice clean pruning cut, that allows that callus tissue to start to grow over the wound in a nice orderly fashion and kind of slowly move back over that cut surface and grow over it. If we have a really ragged, jagged cut, that plant's going to have to put additional growth to grow over that, and it's just going to take a little bit longer. So really, the smoothest, cleanest cut we can make is a nice, sharp pair of hand pruners. But remember, they have a limitation. Only up to about 1 inch in diameter are they going to be able to proficiently cut. So don't cut a limb that's too big. If you need to cut a larger limb, go to loppers. They have a little bit more leverage in those handles. They can cut up to, depends on the species, but up to about 2 to 3 inches of diameter, depending on the plant. The thing I do want to impress upon folks, though, is that you really want to have a bypass style of pruners. So the red pruners at the left and those loppers you see bypass on their cut, where the other type of pruners, and they really don't make loppers like that anymore, but I've seen some old pairs that have it, is an anvil type cut where it doesn't bypass the cutting surface, it smashes into it. And so when it smashes into it and that limb pops off, You can see some kind of bark is separated from the trunk, and it's just a really traumatic cut. It doesn't make a great cut. So find a good set of bypass pruners, keep them sharp. That's the best tool. So that's the first thing that I would use when I'm starting to prune, are these sharpest, best cuts. Next in line would be some of these turbo cut hand saws or pull saws. And so turbo cut used to be a new thing in the early 2000s. That was kind of relatively new, but nowadays most all the hand saws you buy have a turbo cut type of blade. And all that means is that that blade actually cuts through the wood on the forward stroke and the back stroke. So on both strokes, it cuts. And you can look, if you look closely at the teeth on one of these, if you're holding it, you can see there's teeth oriented to cut both directions, where some of the older hand saws, they only cut when you pull towards yourself. And so that just doesn't make as clean as a cut as if you can cut in both directions. So again, this is not going to be as good of a cut as a pair of hand pruners, but it can be very effective when we get larger than that 1 inch size. I really like mine in a little holster like that. You can see I've got a holster that also has my hand pruners attached. So all that can be right on your hip. You can grab it, make a cut, put it away, move the limb, do all the stuff you need to do. For cuts a little higher up in the air, I love these sectional pull saws. And you can see mine there is made out of ash. That's a wood pull saw handle, but they make them as plastic and other materials. They have interchangeable heads. You can have a pull saw, a saw blade head like that, or you could have kind of like a loppers. A pull clip is what I've always called that has a little rope you can pull. So there's other attachments you can put onto these, but really like the options for the pull saw, because that saves me from having to get up on a ladder or do anything unsafe. So you can easily use that to reach limbs a little higher up. And so kind of like the last thing that I would ever choose to make a cut, this has to be a big limb, is a chainsaw. It's mechanized, it's a motor, it saves on some of the elbow grease. It's not as, you don't have to use a handsaw and use some energy to do that, but those turbo cut saw blades, you would be really surprised at how big of a limb you can cut off really quickly. They just do a great job if you keep a nice sharp blade on your handsaw. A chainsaw, there's just a lot of issues with the maintenance and operation of that saw, keeping the chain sharp. And then the biggest thing, and what was hammered into my head as an arborist, is safety. It's very dangerous to use a chainsaw. Tree care is just a dangerous place to work. So we really focused on a lot of safety. And the second you start that chainsaw, your risk goes way up. So chainsaw is always the last thing that I'm looking to use, and it's only for the bigger cuts. Finally, just a note on ladders. Anytime you get up off the ground, you're starting to increase your risk, lower your safety. There are really awesome adjustable ladders these days that kind of fold. They can make an A-frame, they can go straight. Leveling blocks are huge, and we've made those out of just pieces of wood that you can put kind of under, like flat pieces of flat plywood stacked on top of each other. You can attach together and have little steps, so that can help level one side of your ladder. But nowadays they actually make ladders with self-leveling little legs that can extend and things. So ladders are another great option, but just always think twice before leaving the ground. Have someone spotting you and holding that ladder for you if you do choose to use a ladder. All right, so now let's talk about when and how to prune, and then we'll go to some specific examples. So when's the ideal time for pruning? Well, the ideal time is really during dormancy. So all of our trees go dormant during the wintertime. Some of that's a result of an adaptation for the drought conditions that winter exhibits. Water's locked up and frozen, so they don't have the availability of water. So they go dormant. And so pruning while they're dormant is the best. So when is the best time, even within, the dormant season is really kind of late winter. So like right now, all the way through, once the buds start to break, that's too late. So I've got some swelling Norway maple buds there from last year in the picture at the right. You can see those bud scales are starting to separate. That bud's starting to open up. Once that's happened, our pruning window has closed. The tree's starting to invest energy into all those buds, and everything that we cut off at that time of year is removing energy the tree would otherwise have for all of its other life processes throughout the year. So So pruning during dormancy preserves energy. It's the least stressful time to the plant. What's the next best time? The next best time is, early summer after the foliage matures. So I'm in Central Illinois, Zone 5B. I usually say that's for most all woody species, by mid-June, you can pretty much say leaves have emerged and that foliage has matured. Leaves have reached their full size. So that's the point at which we feel like a tree has the energy that it's invested in these buds at the start of the year and leaf growth. It's photosynthesized enough by the time that leaf reaches full size that it's broken even on the energy investment if we cut off that limb. So that's why we try to time it for after that foliage fully matures. So kind of early to midsummer in there is kind of the second best pruning window. So what are some of the bad times then? A bad time to prune is late summer to fall. It sometimes can stimulate water sprout growth or another flush of growth because we've shocked that tree. We've stressed it kind of in mid-growing season. Those wounds are going to stay open, for just almost the maximum amount of time. Like the tree's starting to, it's starting to phase towards dormancy at late summer or into the fall. You make that pruning cut, you might not have much callus tissue response, much growth response at this time of the year. The absolute worst possible time that we can prune is during flowering or during leaf out. So once those buds start to break, that's what I'm considering leaf out, all the way up to, mature leaf development, especially during flowering. That's a time of high energy investment by the plant in those flower structures. And if you don't allow leaves to emerge and start to return some energy through photosynthesis, that plant's invested tons of energy in all those limbs that are flowering. And if you cut them off, again, it disrupts the energy flow. It risks tree health. So, and I say energy reserves are low, and that's because during flowering, during leaf out, that tree has invested all of its energy reserves in that new flush of growth. So that's just like the absolute worst time of year that you could prune. So to start to kind of frame, how do we figure out, this art and science of pruning? We've looked at how to make a cut. So kind of covered that today. Hopefully you're starting to understand how to make that individual cut, but how do we apply that across the canopy of the tree? And so the best way I've been able to express that is in specific written pruning objectives. And when I was a commercial arborist, each of our clients would get in our sales contract, this tree is being pruned, here are the objectives that we're pruning it by. And so that was an easy communication to the client. Hey, these arborists understand what they're, how to prune my tree, and here's the things they're going to do. It was also great for my crew because I could hand that to a crew member and say, here's your pruning objectives, prune the plant for these items. So those objectives vary, by the age of the plant, the species. Is it a tree or a shrub? Are there any health issues that we worry about? Is there a particular look, so an aesthetic that we're going for with this pruning? Sometimes pruning is very artistic and we ignore some of the rules that may be a health concern. And again, the time of the season. And if you're, the reality of tree care is that a lot of pruning happens in the summertime. A lot of pruning doesn't happen in the ideal windows I just identified. I think most all folks that are pruning plants understand during flowering and leaf out, you just absolutely can't prune during leaf drop and that whole several week period there. You just absolutely can't. But at times you're at a client's house and there's a limb that's just in the way and you've got to prune it off. So maybe you say, even though this isn't the ideal time, this is a really healthy plant, I'm going to get that one limb out of the way of your sidewalk right now. So that's how by season you may kind of adjust your pruning objectives. But just to look at what are some of the pruning objectives for a shade tree? Now, again, this is a shade tree I'm talking about. This is not necessarily a fruit tree. Those are different pruning objectives. So this is pruning to influence a shade tree is really focused on, a shade tree. We want the maximum amount of growth out of it. We want to maximize its upward growth, not its outward growth necessarily, or its inner growth. We want to have a nice balanced canopy that gets large quickly and can provide that shade. So the primary objective really in any pruning, and that would be right at the top of every line in our tree pruning contract, would be remove the dead, diseased, and dying limbs. So again, any of those dead limbs, that's just like a big giant branch stub like we saw in that tulip poplar. The tree's not able to seal over those dead limbs. We need to get them out of there. So any time of year, you can prune off dead limbs. Diseased and dying limbs, we still, if we can follow that ideal model, we really want to kind of design those pruning times for, the dormant season. So that's dead, diseased, and dying limbs. That's objective 1. Secondary objectives are all those listed here. So establishing a central leader, that is the central growing point of the plant, the highest limb, the leader, the tallest point. If we don't have that in the upper canopy for your typical shade tree, that's a problem. The tree's wasting energy and trying to outcompete itself within its canopy. So sometimes a tree needs help in getting that central leader established. Duplicating limbs are just 2 limbs like you see in the picture here that are growing to the same location. Over time, they're going to shade each other. They're going to compete with each other. If we can prune one out, then the tree has more energy to focus on the other one. It has more energy to focus on disease defenses, root growth, all the other things that it has to invest energy in every year. Structurally weak limbs, you can see that bottom limb has a big scratch on it, a big wound. Those are going to be the structurally weak ones, either wounds that have some damage, or we'll look at on the next slide, a sure indicator of a structurally weak limb. Crossing stems, that's self-explanatory. We don't want things crossing and rubbing off the bark. Another objective can be improving air circulation, and that really specifically deals with a lot of the fungal leaf infections that trees can get. If we can get more drying into that canopy, more airflow, that makes it less favorable for fungal growth. Ground clearance is always something. Any plant in an urban setting where humans are around it or in your yard, ground clearance is usually an issue. So that's usually one of our objectives. That's not a tree health thing. In most cases, it's more of kind of one of those aesthetics. And water sprouts, I'll talk about that. Water sprouts and other limbs with weak attachments, we want to prune out of there. And that's thinking long-term, how we can, long-term address some of these issues. So when I talked about removing structurally weak limbs, here's kind of the basis for making that determination. We have U-shaped branches like the one at the right there, a wide crotch angle, I call a U-shaped branch. And we have a V-shaped branch that is a really narrow branch union, like we see at the left here, where that's really tight right here. And this caption talks about included bark. That's what this branch bark ridge becomes as these limbs expand. Bark gets trapped in there, and that causes a little pocket of rot right in the branch union. So we want, as we're pruning and looking at different limbs, when you have 2 limbs growing to the same spot and you need to pick one or the other, the one that has a more U-shaped branch angle is a better choice than one that has a V-shaped branch angle. This will be a much stronger limb over time because it doesn't have that rot concentrating right at the top. Another really important rule is the 1/4 rule, or, up to 1/3 may be permissible. So what we're saying here is that it's typically okay on a healthy plant to prune about 1/4 of the foliage off in a single pruning. And we usually say for shade trees, every 3 to 5 years, you could be repeating that process. So if that gives you some numbers to think about. And, old literature used to tell us about 1/3 was a pretty healthy rate. And that was the recommendation, where in recent years, 1/4 has kind of been a little more of what the recommendation has become. And I think it takes a little bit of interpretation of the species, where in the case of this frontier elm, really vigorously growing plant, I would say we could probably push, the 1/3 limit a little bit more, where on things like oaks that are really slow growing, or on a plant that maybe has a little bit of sign of stress, we don't want to prune a very stressed tree, but if you just think there's, in the case of that elm, it's probably stressed a little bit because it does have turf grass right up to its trunk. Maybe we should phase more towards the 1/4. So I generally say the recommendation is about 1/4 of the foliage, 1/4 of the limbs, however you want to look at that 1/4. And it also applies to an individual limb. If you're looking at this one large limb that's hanging off to the right of the plant, how much of this limb can I prune away before I should just cut the whole limb off at the trunk? If you need to prune more of about 1/4 of that foliage, or 1/4 of the limb off, you're probably better off to prune it back to the trunk or leave it alone, one or the other, depending on the condition of the plant. So I've always been like a very mathematically minded person. And so to me, the best way to describe pruning objectives. So if we go back to that list, in a minute, I will go back to that list of all the pruning objectives. Keep in mind, we have about 1/4 of the canopy we can prune. how do we decide which objective to address first? And to me, making that decision kind of goes back to the order of operations. If you can think back to math class, there's a distinct order that each one of these equations should be solved, with parentheses first, exponents, then all the way down to adding and subtracting. There's a distinct order of operations you must follow. We can apply the same thing to pruning. If you want to get really mathy and nerdy about it, we can assign the same thing to pruning objectives. So here's the equation we're looking to balance, or the order of operations that we need to do to accomplish this in pruning. And this is how I've just kind of always visualized it in my mind, where our pruning objectives are on the left side, and in order of priority in this case, I've kind of prioritized those, where if I was going to hand this to a crew member and we had, a list of plants that we were going to prune and say, accomplish these pruning objectives, the recommendation would be to start at the top and move down the list. So we'd take all the dead, diseased, and dying out. We'd establish a central leader. We'd remove duplicating stems. And all along, we'd be thinking in our head, are we getting to about a fourth of the foliage of this plant? And once we hit that limit, as we move down this prioritized list of objectives, again, in our order of operations, once we reach about a fourth of the foliage, then we've got to kind of stop. So that's, and that just, it helped people to kind of divide up the pruning in their head. You're looking at that whole canopy of the plant. It's just overwhelming. Where do I even start? Well, I can start by removing the dead and disease. The next thing I can do is the central leader, and then once you hit the 1/4, you're done. So it's just an easy way to kind of isolate it and look at it in a really quantitative form. All right, so let's talk about, some examples of pruning. Again, what are the fundamentals? Identifying the species, genus may be okay. And I said I'd say a little bit more about that. Those crab apples in the middle picture there are a good example. I hate to say every crab apple I would handle the same, but most crab apples have a similar growth habit unless they've been bred for some specifics. And so most crab apples, although we may not be able to go down to species, would have a similar pruning strategy. But there's other cases where in the hydrangeas, we'll talk about those a little bit later, you really need to get down to species or even the specific variety to understand its pruning needs. So it depends, I guess. Again, look at the entire plant before we start to prune. The tree lilac in the bottom corner there has really imbalanced. It has a lot of growth on the right side, a little bit of growth on the left side. If you start pruning on the left side and hadn't looked at the right side, you might have a really imbalanced plant. So I always encourage folks to take a walk all the way around the plant. At times while you're pruning, step back, look at the whole plant, get a better view to see it all. And then finally, never make a cut without a good reason. And that goes back to the order of operations, following those pruning objectives. I was always hounding people on my crew, have a reason for every cut you make. Don't just make that cut because the limb is in the way. You need to be thinking about those, or you're going to quickly get to your 1/4 of the foliage and not have addressed enough of the objectives. Young tree pruning is incredibly important. And we're really starting to see through research that a lot of the issues we see later in life can be addressed with young tree pruning. And especially in studies of municipal trees, it's hard to really have a large scale study that involves a lot of residential trees, but in municipal trees owned by cities that are along city right-of-ways, it's just a chronic problem that we're not addressing a lot of these issues in young tree pruning. So for homeowners, for master gardeners, for folks that are pruning things at their property, remember, it's the pruning you can do in the first 5 to 10 years of this plant's life can really be critical to setting it up for success. And really the bottom line is that it focuses the growth on our healthy long-term stems. If we're removing, again, we're looking for those V-shaped stems. All the things that we've talked about pruning out, we're trying to get rid of when that plant's young. So let's look at a specific pruning prescription for this red maple here in the picture. Never been pruned in its life. And probably somewhere on the order of 10 to 15 years old, maybe even 20 years old if it didn't have a lot of growing space in that parking lot. So here's the kind of the prioritized order of operations that I would recommend for this plant. And so number one, again, is dead, dying, and diseased stems, establishing a central leader. And then with this plant, we really want to look at, establishing those permanent scaffolding branches. So that's the structure of this plant that will, maintain its shade canopy for the rest of its life. And it's important that we get that established, where you can see there is just a ton of limbs that come out right at the base, right about 4 to 5 feet up there. We've got a whole cluster of limbs. So for young trees, and that's, less than 5 years old, we'd be looking for, 6 to 12 inches of spacing between those major scaffolding limbs. And that's not just, that doesn't count smaller twigs and other things. On a younger plant, you may have smaller twigs, but on the permanent ones that we want forever, that's about the spacing we look at. Whereas those plants get beyond 5 years old, get a little bit older, those permanent scaffolding limbs should be spread out further across the limb. So 20 to 24 inches of spacing. And, the reason is we want them evenly spread up and down the trunk is what I'm talking about, and that spacing up and down would be that direction. To keep them evenly spaced out, to have them not compete with each other. And in the event that one limb fails, we don't have a major wound right there, right next to another limb. Where at the bottom of this plant, if we had a windstorm and there was some limb failure at the bottom, there'd be a lot of wounds in one place if some limbs got tore off or had to be cut off. So the timing for this, dormant season, so late winter or early spring. And our recommendation is the 1/4 rule. But I do want to look a little closer at the top of this plant, where you can see we don't really have a great central leader. There's not one stem that is the tallest and the straightest growing stem. We have kind of two that are competing right here. So that is an issue with this plant, where the tree's expending a lot of energy on the competition between these two. If we want this plant to get taller faster, it helps to have a clearly established leader. So a choice has to be made here. I've kind of put an arrow on each leader. Do we make a cut here and cut off one or the other? It's kind of a judgment call. Like I talked about earlier, that's a pretty large diameter cut compared to the diameter of the stem right here. So I think what my choice would be to move up a little further and prune off something like this limb to focus the growth on this stem right here that has a little better chance, I feel like, and what we call subordination of this limb. So we're clipping it back. I probably would prune a little bit out here to lower its height. We're leaving it here, and maybe in the next pruning cycle, it would come off back here, because the theory is that we would focus more growth on this side of the branch union, and this stem would get larger. And so then when we made this cut, it would be not as big of a diameter in relation to the stem diameter. Now let's look at a little bit different of a plant. These crab apples we saw the picture of earlier, I'd have a different pruning order of operations for these. You notice I don't have establishment of a central leader as a major pruning objective. Crab apples tend to kind of spread out. They tend to not really have that central leader. So in this case with the crab apple, dead, dying, and diseased limbs are huge. They can have some canker issues on their limbs. They can have some other things that we can prune out. Removing structurally weak limbs. So crossing and rubbing branches. If you've ever had a crab apple in your yard, they're really thick with limb growth. They really have a lot of branch wood in there. So kind of thinning it out, removing some of those, removing water sprouts and suckers, improving air circulation. That goes back to fungal leaf issues, and improving ground clearance, because this, there's ongoing maintenance that happens under these. I could see mower damage to a lot of those lower limbs, so we need a little bit of ground clearance. So you may be wondering, what are water sprouts? Well, I'm going to zoom in a little bit onto one of those, and all these vertical shoots right here are what we would call water sprouts. They're from dormant buds right there that have had a little bit more light on them. And they just grow really rapidly. They have a weak attachment, and we don't want those to grow into a major part of the canopy. If you've dealt with managing crab apples much, they are notorious for water sprouts all over the canopy. If you prune those out in the wintertime, at the bottom there, I say, may require some summer follow-up on those water sprouts. Plan to come back and maybe follow up on those water sprouts in midsummer or so to really clean them up. But it's kind of a continual maintenance issue with crab apples. Another thing is suckers, which are the sprouts that grow at the base of the trunk. Those can be removed year-round whenever you see them, and that's just the best thing I've found, is just to kind of keep them clipped back at ground level. Let's look at conifers really quick. I have a couple examples here. So a little bit different of an order of operations. You know, removing the dead, diseased and dying limbs, that's always going to be our number one objective. But conifers really need a central leader established well, and that can really disrupt their growth when they have competing stems, either from storm damage or something else that's kind of disrupted their growth. Because if you think about your typical conifer, it's very pyramidal in shape, looks like a big triangle, kind of like this bald cypress does here. And so maintaining that shape is really important for their growth. So we would really focus on central leader, removing the structurally weak stems. So any of those V-shaped stems, any stems with damage to them, and then kind of maintaining that, again, that pyramidal shape is some of the goal. We do need to know at least a genus in this case. And it relates to the terminal buds, like our pine species, you know, that's kind of, Pinus is the genus. Species in the Pinus genus typically don't have sorry, that's an error. It should be dormant buds, not terminal. Well, yeah, terminal buds only. So they lack lateral buds or dormant buds. Pines often do. That's why you see a lot of pine trees in parks pruned up really high and no limbs on the trunk. There's no dormant buds to respond and grow. Where firs, spruces, yews, hemlocks, arborvitaes, many of the junipers do have lateral or dormant buds in place, where if you prune off a limb, something will grow back there. So that's important to understand. I just want to point out another example here, this white pine, where, you know, probably should have been very pyramidal in shape, but look, it's got a lot of growth up at the top. You can see it doesn't really have a central leader that's great, you know, easily identifiable. And what's happened with this plant is its limbs have gotten really long and heavy on the tips over time. And so it's kind of hard to see, but there's stubs all down the side of this plant. In an ice storm, something broke out up here and just snapped off everything down this side of the tree. So a major focus on pruning with especially large mature white pines and other conifers is kind of weight reduction out on the branch tips. So what can we do to reduce some weight out here? So when snow and ice get on this, or when wind starts to blow it, there's not as much pressure and not as much of a chance for those limbs to break out. All right, let's move to some shrubs now and talk about how to prune shrubs. It's a little bit different. So two categories of shrubs, or really almost three here, but flowering shrubs that will break into two categories, and then evergreen shrubs are the two kinds of shrub prunings that I'll cover today. And so flowering shrubs, again, really needs to probably go down to species, but I'll show you in the next slide when we talk about hydrangeas that it almost goes down to specific variety. But we can break these into two categories of spring flowering. So that's before July 1, typically, that they flower on old wood. And that means that those flower buds that you see first thing in spring, they grew on a stem during last growing season. So now another thing that I'll say about this is the major pruning objective here is not necessarily plant health, but it's preserving that flower display. So to preserve those flower buds, we need to prune those immediately after flowering. So I kind of have some examples of some of the common species that flower before July 1st. So as soon as they flower, we need to do our pruning then. And so then after we've pruned, the buds for next year have a chance to grow all summer. Where summer flowering shrubs flower on new wood. So that means that they're going to grow in next growing season. They're going to send out a new growth and they're going to flower on that. So it doesn't matter if we prune them in late winter. During the time, again, a late winter dormant season pruning is the best thing for plant health. So even if you had a spring flowering shrub that had a little bit of a health issue, you wouldn't want to prune it right after flowering, because again, that's kind of stressful. You would want to follow a different recommendation if that plant is stressed. But pruning in late winter, you're not going to prune off the flower buds for a summer flowering shrub. So flowers after July 1st. So you just want to prune it before new growth starts. And there's a few examples of those summer flowering shrubs below. Hey, there's always exceptions, and hydrangeas are one of those. So some of the hydrangea species we use are spring flowering, some are summer flowering, and some are even both. It's a really diverse genus with 75 species, so you really need to know what plant you're dealing with when you prune. So here's some examples of just the common, summer flowering species. Hydrangea arborescens, that's Annabelle hydrangea. is kind of the common one. Incredible, some of those different varieties. And panicle hydrangea, those are always summer flowering. Where big leaf hydrangea is the one that has, certain varieties such as endless summer that, kind of flower, endlessly. So they have both types of buds. So their pruning, it has to have a different, has to be thought about differently. I would probably prune those during the winter time, during the dormant period, to ensure that we're protecting shrub health at the same time as we're pruning. So the objectives are a little different. We're not as focused on a strong central leader. That's not really a focus of a shrub. They tend to be multi-stemmed and spreading out. A lot of the times it's really removing older wood is one of the major goals, to keep those limbs young and vigorous, maintaining that size that we need for the landscape, and just kind of, improving air circulation, removing the duplicating stems, having a more open shrub canopy that's just a little more efficient is one of the goals. So there's a couple of different just broad categories of pruning. Renewal pruning is pretty common, where we're removing up to a third of the oldest stems at the ground level. And so this type of pruning is not, we aren't focusing on a branch collar so much. We're pruning, very close to the ground level at a convenient spot. And we're not as worried about some rot being introduced right here, because this root system is going to send up new shoots. So, I generally just try and get those cuts as close to the ground as is attractive. You don't want really long stubs right there. Sometimes it's a really thick wad down at the base of that trunk. So you've got to kind of get in there and get those out. But essentially, every 2 to 3 years, we're taking a third of the oldest stems out, and that focuses the growth on these newer, more vigorous little stems coming up. So the best example I can think of are lilac and red twig dogwood. They both really benefit from this. Lilac, better flowering, healthier stems. It has less problems with some of the stem diseases it gets. Red twig dogwood, obviously, it keeps those younger growth is more red and prettier, so keeps that going. Rejuvenation pruning is what I used to always refer to as the clear cut pruning method, basically cutting everything off at ground level. And so you really do need to understand your shrub species. Some won't respond to this, but many do. But it's really pretty easy. Just as close as you can get to the ground without getting your saw kind of in the dirt, or your pruning tool in the dirt, you're going to kind of try and prune those off. Another recommendation, I don't always do this, but is root pruning, where you take a spade and you go around and sever all the roots. This is typically those really vigorously growing shrubs. Forsythia is a great example. It's just going to expand and get huge if you don't do anything. So cutting it back, root pruning is a great idea. And, spirea is another one that really does well with this rejuvenation type pruning. I get the question a lot. Should I shear my shrubs? Should I hand prune them? How should I prune my shrubs? Shearing gets that formal hedge look like you see at the left, but it doesn't make horticulturally correct pruning cuts. We're just indiscriminately cutting all the stems. Where hand pruning, we're cutting back to a bud, to a branch union. We're spending a lot more time on it. I like that natural look at the right compared to the formal look at the left. That's my opinion. So if you really want the formal hedge look, probably your best route is with shears, but keep in mind, you're not making horticulturally correct pruning cuts. And over time, you're going to have just a thin shell of foliage on the outer part of that shrub canopy. The inner part's going to be bare. Where hand pruning, you have a pretty even distribution of the foliage on the inner and outer part of the shrub canopy, and that's important. That just makes a healthier plant if you can do that. So what are some of the conclusions from today? Well, a big one is how to make the proper cuts. So if you can start to learn and practice that, that's just a big step in all of this. But remembering those fundamentals of, identifying the plant first, assessing the whole plant, never making a cut without a good reason. Think back to your pruning objectives. Should I be cutting this limb off before I go deal with the central leader? Maybe I shouldn't be. And just try and write those objectives in an order of operations if you can. It can help sort out how to make those cuts. It can help you in your mind kind of work through this giant puzzle of a whole canopy and apply things systematically to not over prune your 1/4 and to accomplish those pruning objectives of making a healthier plant. So That's my last slide, but I do want to point you all to our large library of Four Seasons seminars. So we have all those are posted online where you can see here all of our past ones. This one will be added once we get it edited a little bit. Also, if you have a chance on your device to scan this code, or Nancy can plunk this little URL into the chat box. We'd love to hear from you, get your feedback on our program evaluation. It really helps us kind of plan our programming